Episode 3: A Horse Thief, a Blacksmith, and a Mystery Man. An act of the legislature of the state of Michigan officially created Rose Township in March of 1837. The first township meeting was held on April 3rd of 1837 at Gage's Tavern. These were the township officers that needed to be elected at that first township meeting. Who got elected? Well, as supervisor, John A. Wendell. He had parcels of land in sections 22 and 27. He was both a farmer and a carpenter. He had also served in the War of 1812 as a teamster. That was someone who was in charge of bringing supplies during the war. He served from 1837 to 1840 as supervisor, and then again in 1842 and 1844. Henry Phelps was chosen town clerk. He was also chosen as one of the justices of the peace. Henry Phelps had 2 parcels of land in the northern part of Rose, in sections 4 and sections 5. He had come with his father, Joel Phelps, to Rose Township. Joel Phelps was 80 years old when he came to Rose. He had been a soldier in the Revolutionary War. He died just 1 year after coming to Rose in 1838 and was buried in Rose Center Cemetery. He's one of only 34 Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Oakland County. It wasn't long after the death of his father that Henry Phelps moved to Milford. That was where his brother Aaron had a sawmill and a distillery, but he didn't stay there long. He moved then to Jackson County, to the little settlement of Michigan Center, where he tried to run his own distillery business, but it was a failure. And then things seemed to go further downhill for Henry Phelps. In 1844, he was arrested for stealing horses. Being a horse thief was a serious crime at that time, and he was sentenced to 5 years in the newly opened Michigan State Prison at Jackson. Sadly, Henry Phelps drowned in the Huron River at Dexter in 1858 and was buried there in Dexter. Pardon Hicks was also chosen as one of the justices of the peace. He had the farm down in section 35 near the southern edge of Rose Township. By 1840, he had moved down the road to the little settlement of White Lake, which was in White Lake Township, and he was working at his trade of being a blacksmith. By 1850, he was working as a blacksmith in Fentonville, which is what Fenton was called at the time. He died there in 1855 and was buried in Fenton. Jonathan Bennett was another justice of the peace. The 1840 census shows John Bennett living in Rose Township with his wife Mary and their 7 children. His family was apparently living on one of 3 parcels of land in section 21. But those parcels of land were not owned by Jonathan Bennett. They were owned by his half-sister, Charity Miller. She was an unusual person because she was one of the few women to have an original land patent for land in Oakland County. By 1850, however, Jonathan Bennett and his family had moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's unclear why they'd moved so far. But according to family records, Jonathan, his wife Mary, and Theodore, one of the sons, all died in September of 1850. But it's unclear what the cause of death was. At that time, the oldest son, John, took the other 3 children back to live in Rose Township, where all of them lived for a while. John A. Wendell was elected the 4th Justice of the Peace, giving John Wendell 2 jobs. Joseph C. Wendell, his son, was elected assessor. Joseph Wendell had 3 parcels of land in Section 22. Like his father, Joseph Wendell will also serve as Rose Township supervisor in 1853 through 57, again in 1860, and from 1873 to 1877. Pardon Hicks was also chosen one of the assessors, giving Pardon Hicks a second job. Everett Wendell was chosen as tax collector. He was also elected as one of the constables. It probably made sense in those days that if you're going to be collecting taxes, it might help if you're also a police officer. Everett Wendell had land in Section 26 of Rose Township. By the early 1840s, he was also running a tavern, the Buckhorn Tavern, which had replaced the Gage Tavern. Another constable was William J. Lane. He's a mystery. He doesn't show up on the 1840 census of Rose. He doesn't show up on the map that shows all the original landowners of Rose. In fact, he just doesn't seem to show up anywhere. He's a mystery. Another bit of a mystery as a constable was Stephen Hovey. Stephen Hovey only owned land, just a small parcel, in Highland Township. John Wendell was elected one of the poor masters, giving him his third job. The other poor master was Eber Weed. You'd think with a name like Eber Weed, it'd be easy to find historical records about you, but that's not the case. The only Eber Weed that shows up being near Rose at that time is someone who was living in Fentonville. He was living there with his wife and a small child. It appears his wife had died by 1847 because, according to records, he remarried at that time to a young widow named Mary Ann, who had 2 daughters. It appears that he died on April 10th of 1850 and was buried in Fentonville. The 1850 census shows his widow Mary running a small hotel in Fentonville with just 2 roomers. That was likely the business that Eber Weed had been running when he died. Nothing more is known about Mary Weed. Her daughters, however, did marry people from Fentonville and lived there for a while. The highway commissioner was Joseph C. Wendell, giving him a second job. He was joined by Pardon Hicks, giving him a third job. And then Abraham Wortman. Abraham Wortman owned several parcels of land in Rose Township, in sections 1, 5, 9, 13, and 24. The 1840 census of Rose shows Abraham and his wife Ann, both in their 70s, living in Rose Township. That would make Abraham the oldest of the elected officers. It's likely that Abraham and Ann were living on this parcel of land that he owned. Their son, James Wortman, who had been a soldier in the War of 1812, was probably living on this piece of farmland. And their daughter, Margaret, who had married Horace Ballard, was living on this piece of farmland. According to this document, which is a witness statement for a marriage, Anne must have died by 1847, because that's when Abraham Wortman remarried. He was 81 at the time, and he married Catherine Van Avery, who was 54. According to family records, Abraham died somewhere around 1852, but it's unclear where he was buried. And finally, the final and last elected officer, David Gage, who was chosen as pathmaster. David Gage, of course, was the tavern owner. By October of 1837, that tavern had become a post office. That was when Rose was officially awarded a post office by the government. The first postmaster to be selected, John A. Wendell. He would serve from 1837 until his death in 1858, and then he'd be replaced by his son, Everett Wendell. By 1839, a mail route had been established between Pontiac and Shiawassee, and it traveled right through Rose. It was 56 miles in length. Originally, the mail was carried on horseback, but it wasn't long after that it was carried by stagecoach. It was decided if you were going to carry mail by stagecoach, you might as well carry passengers too. And that's when David Gage's Tavern became a stagecoach stop. Rose was officially a township, and it had a government. And for the most part, those government officials lived on farms that were located along the few roads that were there in Rose Township. Gage's Tavern had now become a post office and a stagecoach stop. What would happen next? Stay tuned. There's more history to come.